think the most important thing when you're making a low budget production is that you do have good sound. And one of the easiest and cheapest ways to achieve that, I think, is to hire someone who you can sort of, watch their reel and make sure that they've got it together. But yeah, I think getting someone to do the job for you and really focus their attention on the sound is probably the best way to make sure you have a good recording in the end. Working in post-production, there's nothing worse than being on the stage and having a really beautiful scene that is messed up by poorly recorded audio, or by a choice in shooting location that could have been changed had there been someone thinking about audio. I think when you're thinking about making a whole film, there are a lot of little things you have to kind of consider, and sometimes the accidents or the mistakes that happen in sound turn out to be really beautiful and help. But if you're focusing on too much, you aren't letting time in for those little mistakes to happen and to sort of like go down that path that you might not have expected. So low, no budget film, hire a student for free who's going to be dedicated to the post-production. And that doesn't mean that you can't step in as the producer or whatever, the director. But I think having someone on the team dedicated to sound is probably the most important thing. So the things that are like really important for good sound is, one, that the location sounds good. So picking a location that doesn't have too much traffic noise, doesn't have too many airplane bys, doesn't have a subway going under it. Those are really important. After choosing a good location, it's really important to make sure that whoever's operating the boom microphone is putting it in the right position, and that whoever the DP is aware of the fact that the boom op, that it's necessary for the boom op to be in a good position. So I think there are like a whole bunch of little things that you can do as a director to make sure that whoever is recording your sound, whether it's a sound person or not, there are small things that you can do to help them, achieve better results. Choosing a good location, choosing the right microphone for that particular scene. If it's outdoor, it should be a shotgun. If it's indoor, maybe it's going to be, a cardioid. If it's a long shot, maybe it's going to be a wireless. It's really simple choices like that, I think, can have big impacts, especially when you do them incorrectly. If you're doing a wide shot and using a boom, that's probably not the right choice. If you're doing a walk and talk and your DP's footsteps are really, really loud, you're not going to be able to use the sound. So there are like a lot of little things that a director can focus on. I think that one of the things that makes soundtracks really stand out as beautiful or particularly good sounding is originality. There are plenty of really good sound effects libraries that you can get great sounds from, but especially on a low budget production, when there might be like a little of wiggle room in terms of exactly what the sound people can do, sending your sound recordist to record 5 minutes of ambience in the location that you're shooting can just make your film sound so much more original, even if you're layering that with sound library effects. That's important. So I would say, one, recording your own sound effects is something that you can do. You can get a Zoom and record your sound effects on a Zoom. That's perfectly acceptable. And I've done that on the things that I work on professionally. So then the question becomes, what's the timeline? And obviously, the quicker the timeline, the more decisions you have to make about what's important and what's not. Ultimately, it always comes down to the story, and whatever sounds the story requires, those are the sounds that you need to put in. And depending on the timeline, you can choose to make those sounds really special, or you can just throw something in you found online because it just needs to be there. But definitely having a spotting session as you're preparing to do a sound effects edit is really crucial. I think it's important to watch the film, watch the show, down once and jot down your thoughts, and think about the sounds that you were missing, because it's the first impression that the audience is gonna, the audience has one impression of a film. They walk in the theater, they see it, they leave. They don't have the ability to listen to a scene over and over and like catch the subtleties. So the sounds that are important to the story are the sounds that have to be good, and focusing on those, I think, is another good way of approaching sound editing if you're doing low budget. Just to take it like to the other side of the spectrum, you have an unlimited budget, let's say, for sound. At that point, I think the process becomes listening very carefully to every sound you possibly can and choosing every single sound that you use very carefully. And so then as the timeline shortens and shortens and shortens and you have less and less time to really listen, then it becomes important just to choose the sounds that are telling the story and make sure those are right. And kind of, I don't want to say forget the other sounds. I don't want to say forget the backgrounds. But yeah, the important sounds to the stories are the ones you want to focus on first. And I have the unique position of being the editor and the mixer on the TV show. So what I edit goes to the stage and then I have to mix it. So that is a learning experience in and of itself, which is why I say the thing about the story. Because if the sounds you choose are right for the story, you can't really mess up the mix in some sense, right? But I guess the way I approach sound effects mixing is that, again, the sounds have to serve the story. The dialogue is king in a film that is about dialogue, and so your sound effects should never be covering the dialogue. And next in importance is the music, because the music is going to tell you how to feel emotionally. So sort of like when you work down the food chain and finally get to the sound effects, you want to be supportive, and you want to add flavor, but you never want to distract from the story. If there's a really cool sound effect that you love, that takes your attention away from the screen, you can't use it. You have to get rid of it. And I think that's the most important thing. The story is the most important thing, and that's how I approach sound effects mixing. What's best for the story? It's really about letting go of your babies. There will always be shots that you love, sounds that you love, and all of this, but it's not important what you like. The story has taken on a life of its own at that point, right? The shots you got are the shots you got. The edit you have is the edit you have. You must serve that edit and that story, and not the story you have in your head. I think that's probably difficult for a director in general to sort of take themselves out of a project and see it with fresh eyes. So if there's anything I could tell a director, it would be to try to do that. And a lot of times for me, as a sound effects editor, that just means bringing someone else into the room. Playing back my sounds for someone else will immediately tell me what's right and what's wrong. I think probably the same would be true for a director. Screening it with someone who you trust to give you good advice sonically is probably a great way to go. You want to make sure your audience is happy. If it's an art piece, maybe there's a little more leniency. But if it's a piece that you're really trying to put out there to have audience members enjoy, then you have to think about it from their point of view. When you're editing backgrounds, for instance, on your own film, you probably know really well the problems with the dialogue track because you were on set. So you understand when the car buys are happening in the dialogue and you understand where the noise is. So doing everything you can with the backgrounds in particular, but then with the hard effects secondly, to smooth out your dialogue track, to make the dialogue feel as natural as possible is probably very important. Dialogue that is unintelligible should obviously be ADR'd, but dialogue that's noisy, a lot of times you can mask it with well-chosen, well-placed backgrounds. And I find myself doing that on Blue Bloods all the time. If an airplane passes overhead. Maybe you add an airplane pass later in the scene. Or even better, add it before it happens, so that when it happens on the dialogue track, the audience doesn't even think about it because they've already heard an airplane. It's already been established that there might be airplanes passing. So little things like that that you can do to sort of trick your audience into thinking the noise on the dialogue track is actually natural and you want it there, I think is probably a good way to go. The last thing I would say is that it's probably useful to, at the very least, have someone sit down and mix the film for you. You know, while you could do a mix yourself, and it might turn out just fine, you know, like Isotope Final Mix might get you 90% of the way there. But having other people involved in the process makes your work better. The more heads you have on a project, the better it sounds. And I always find that. No matter what you put in, if you have 2 other people listen to it and give you their ideas, then that's 2 less people that are going to leave the theater wishing they had heard something different. You know? So the more people you can sort of show it to that you trust, the better. When I edit my sound effects, I am doing a pre-mix as I go. So whenever I place a sound, I am making sure that it's, you know, not hitting the compressor too hard. I'm making sure that the equalization is correct for the scene. You know, I'm doing all of those little technical things that, you know, probably would make sense to any sound person, but might not necessarily make sense to a director. And so going off on that, it's just really important that, like I said before, the sounds you choose to play are the correct sounds. If the sounds you're choosing to play are correct, that is the temp mix. That is the premix, you know. It's a different thing when you get to the mix stage and every sound is just kind of wrong. And then you have to like compress it really heavily to bring out the characteristics you like, or you have to EQ it to get rid of the characteristics you don't. And at that point, you're just spinning your gears and not really getting anywhere, you know. You can polish a turd, but it's still just a polished turd. Or you can really find a piece of gold and then polish it, and then it's really going to shine. If I'm going to be mixing my sound effects, I make sure that it's hitting the compressor okay, that it's equalized correctly. If I'm preparing an edit for another mixer, I will make sure the same things are happening but in a different way. So whereas if I'm editing myself, maybe I'm editing in my own template that has my own plugins. But if I'm editing for another mixer, particularly a mixer who's going to mix it in an analog style, you know, not necessarily in Pro Tools, then I'm giving them options. The first sound would be the raw, unprocessed sound, and the second sound would be the sound as I envision it. So if there's any reverb that I hear, or if there's any compression that needs to be done, I'll do that. But I always make sure to provide the mixer with both so that I'm never tying him into, I'm never pushing him into a hole. You know, you never want to supply a mixer with something that he can't get out of. So giving him options and giving him the right options are really important. So that also means not providing him with too many options. You know, you can't have 65 versions of the same door closing, you know, but you could have one version of the door closing that sounds like it's far back in the room and one version where there's no reverb so it sounds close, you know, so you could do that. But if I was doing my own mix, I would bake those sounds right in. But also probably leave myself room, you know, because if I'm doing my own mix, maybe I'm going to bring it to a different place to mix, so I'm going to hear it a little differently. So, you know, you always want to leave yourself options also. But if you're doing your own mix, then, you know, it's your taste. So you can bake those tastes into your sounds a little bit more with a little more confidence because you know what you like.